Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of our IRR 50 events. I think we're just waiting for a few more people to join the webinar, and then I think we'll start in a couple of minutes. For a few more people to join the webinar. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of our IRR 50 events, where we are launching a unique new resource, the Register of Racism and Resistance, which is a searchable database that documents key developments in racism and community action since 2014. So thank you so much for joining us for this first event. I'm Sophia. I'm the Deputy Editor of Race and Class and Coordinator of IRR News, and today we'll be facilitating the event with Anya and Liam. So this event is the first of our IRR 50 events that we're holding throughout the year to celebrate the Institute of Race Relations history, present and future, with a series of events to mark 50 years since the transformation of the IRR. Many people don't know about our unique origin story. The IRR used to be a policy-orientated establishment academic institution, but in 1972, the staff and its members transformed it into an anti-racist organisation under the leadership of A. Sivanandan. This radical transformation shifted the IRR's focus to the needs of Black people and all those affected by racism, making direct analyses of institutionalised racism in the UK and Europe, as well as internationally in our journal Race and Class. So this year, we'll be celebrating this history, as well as reflecting on the IRR's legacy and how that revolutionary act in 1972 underpins our organisation and continues to live on through our work. So now, turning to today's event, we're so excited to launch this new resource, the Register of Racism and Resistance, as well as to provide a space to reflect on how keeping a record of racism forms a crucial part of anti-racist struggle. We have 4 brilliant speakers today: Sujata Arora, Joseph Maggs, John Grayson, and Habib Kadiri, who I'll introduce shortly to kickstart the conversation by tracing the IRR's legacy of keeping a record of racism, as well as more broadly exploring why this method is so important in their activism, campaign work, and research. So after contributions from all the speakers, Liam will give a short demonstration using the Register of Racism and Resistance, after which we'll open up to a discussion to hear from you all. So please post your questions in the chat box, which should be on the right of your screen. I'll now hand it over to Anya, who'll give a short introduction to the theme of keeping a record.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sophia. As we celebrate 50 years of the Institute, it would be easy to believe that we have ended up holding part of the anti-racist record almost by default, just absorbing and collecting pieces of information that came up over those last 50 years. But the Institute isn't just a place of record because it's well established, but is because it has always known the value of keeping records. Recording cases, events, legislation, resistances, cultural interventions, and many more is a crucial part of the anti-racist tradition itself. In a world that disputes the existence and levels of racism, that isolates incidents as those of being of just one bad apple or a single anomalous tragedy, keeping a record provides a crucial counter-narrative that reveals connections, highlights the extent and continuity of the issue, and most importantly, foregrounds agency. There's a reason that both our calendar and this resource is called the Register of Racism and Resistance and the Calendar of Racism and Resistance. When it's in the interest of the establishment to erase Black and radical histories from the record, keeping them and providing a more inclusive narrative is in itself an act of resistance. That doesn't mean that the records haven't changed over time, both in focus and in format, from the printed word to eventually an online tool, as racism itself doesn't stand still, and we're responding to the needs on the ground. And we can see very clearly how this has changed in the ways that the Institute has been publishing its work and documenting events. We've been keeping a calendar and a record since actually the 60s, so since before the transformation, but where and how has changed. In the early 70s, the focus was on how racism was linked to government policy and the fightbacks of power, Black power and community initiatives. And then the Institute published a record of developments in the magazine Race Today. By the late 70s, the fight was against the links between popular racism and the fascist resurgence, and the IRR worked with Searchlight and CARF, the campaign of against racism and fascism that Sujata is going to speak to document developments. Then through the 80s and 90s, there was the rise of Fortress Europe and the links between immigration controls and state racism. Then in the early 2000s, which saw the rise of Islamophobia and nativism, the IRR moved online and has been publishing an online calendar, first weekly and then every fortnight ever since. The catalogue of cases and stories that we're launching today in the register is actually all the stories in all of these calendars from 2014. And the Register of Racism and Resistance is an online searchable database, and all future calendars will be added to it. So it's a living resource. Having access to these kinds of records and keeping these kinds of records are not just important for preserving our histories, but they're also useful and I would argue vital in our continuing and new fights. They act as a bridge. They help to make sense of the now, but also give us access to an important history, which allows us to understand the world, but also change it. And I'll end with a quote from A. Sivanandan, who was director of the Institute from 72 until 2013, who had a phrase for every occasion, which is, to know where we are going, it is necessary to know where we are at and where we have come from. And now I'll hand back to Sophia, who will introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Anya. So that leads on perfectly to our first speaker, who's Sujata Arora, who's been active in anti-racist and community campaigns for over 30 years and was the first employee of the CARF collective from 1992 to 96. Most recently, she was the chair of the Grunwick 40 Committee, which commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Grunwick strike in northwest London. She now works as a graphic designer with a particular interest in producing material for radical movements. So over to you, Sujata.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Anya, for that little introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. When I was invited to do this, I thought I'd take the opportunity to reflect a bit on how far we've come in terms of technology and using whatever technology is available to us and putting it to serve us, our movements and our causes. And I started thinking about the really painstaking and, forgive me for saying it, but frankly quite tedious task it was to manually cut up newspapers and catalogue the bits that we felt important and then go through them at the end of the week or the month and to compile these calendars. And we literally catalogued these press cuttings and these documents using scissors and glue. You know, it was really primitive, and we had this kind of basic but you know, effective system of categories where we would manually glue each press cutting to different coloured pieces of card and then handwrite the name of the publication and the date at the top. And, you know, I still remember these categories. You know, pink card was for racial violence, blue was for policing, green was for immigration, brown was for the far right and fascism. And, you know, 30 years later, I still use the same colour categories when organising my own material, only now I use the colour tags you can assign to files on a Mac. But, you know, the idea of those colour categories endures because it's so deeply ingrained in me. I think what was actually selected for inclusion in these calendars was also really important. A lot of the material came from sources other than the mainstream press, often from community groups, sometimes from local newspapers. There'd be 3 lines on page 6 of the Somewhere or Other Chronicle about a racist attack where somebody lost an eye and so on. Community campaigns, local struggles against an individual being deported, families fighting for justice after the death of a loved one at the hands of the police. So the nature of what is contained in this resource is actually really important and very unique. And although I'm laughing about the glue and the primitive nature of what we did, the serious point is to really, I think, thank IRR for digitizing this material that's been collated over decades, as Anya explained, by, you know, volunteers for, you know, many decades before me and after me, and to make this accessible and, I believe, searchable online, rather than being stuck in a basement somewhere where it's very difficult to access. I think the idea of documenting history and documenting what's happening is not the thing that's usually at the forefront of our minds when we're in the middle of a campaign, and nor really would anyone expect it to be. But the importance of documentation and memory in any analysis of where we are or where we're going is crucial. What is remembered and what is documented is all intensely political, I feel. The ability to make connections between fragments of information contained in a resource like this is also political. Tracing the threads of how the fascists and the far right interact and interplay with mainstream politicians is political. Drawing a connection between the introduction of a new immigration bill and racist violence on the streets is political. These are all connections which, you know, maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, the mainstream media refuse to make, or perhaps may acknowledge 30 years after the fact. And I mean, important and valuable as they are, we can't really afford to rely on people's memories because, you know, human beings are not going to be around forever. A few years ago, I was part of the commemorations for the Grunwick strike, and they have big events every 10 years to mark the anniversary. And it really struck me on the 40th anniversary that, given the age of the last few living people who participated in that strike, that it might well be the last opportunity ever to hear from people with first-hand memories of that event, as with so many other struggles of that era. And our memories of these struggles are too important to forget. They're too important to die out, and too important to be hidden in a dusty basement in a file somewhere. So whether they're big events or small events, you're going to find them documented in this resource. And let's not forget that sometimes, in hindsight, small events can become big events too. And I think this resource is going to be of really great use to activists as well as to historians. So I'm really glad that IRR has taken this step to make this resource accessible, these bits of hidden history, often ignored history, and to make them accessible before we all become completely decrepit, I guess. Our history is what makes us, really. It's what makes our movements. We've got this incredible resource now that IRR have put online for us. Let's use it. Let's learn from it. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sujata. That was really powerful, and especially thinking about the power of collective histories and how we can use that to fuel our movements. And hopefully we'll come back to the Grunwick strike in particular, and your work in the Grunwick strike 40 campaign in the Q&A as well. And that's a reminder for everyone who's watching to keep putting questions in the comments that we can come to at the end. So we'll next move on to our second speaker, who is Joseph Maggs, who sits on the IRR's Council of Management and contributes to IRR News. He is currently a public law caseworker at Wilson Solicitors, Tottenham, where he works on public law challenges and civil claims against the state, especially in relation to immigration detention. He has a history degree from UCL and a graduate diploma in law, and he was previously an intern at Liberty and has volunteered in various migrant solidarity organisations. So over to you, Joseph. Oh, Joseph, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia, for that, and to the Institute for inviting me, and to everyone for coming, even though I can't see you. This is quite exciting, I think, because I've been working on the calendar for about 3.5 years. It's been around for about 8 years. Then obviously there's the older history of CARF. And I think it's quite quiet work. It's not necessarily being widely distributed or known about. So I think it's about time it becomes accessible as a database. And I think it's important to launch it publicly as well, because I think Sivanandan's and others, people's vision of the Institute since 1972 has been for it to be a kind of servicer of our movements, rather than just a professional, research organization, a resource for communities, campaigns, and movements. And that's what I think the register can be. In terms of how it can be used, I'm not going to be prescriptive. I can think of a lot of different contexts for its use. So I can imagine educators and youth workers working with young people to kind of learn about histories of anti-racist struggle in their area. I can think of local cop watches and anti-raids groups distributing news bulletins and making use of the calendar and the register. And I can think of organizations I've told about the calendar, and they've pretty much invariably found it useful and thought that it was a kind of unique resource because of its breadth, and the consistency of it as well, and how long it's gone on for. So I just thought I'd use this occasion to just make a few reflections on the calendar and why I think it's important. So it's been around for about 8 years, and it's increased in size, I think, over that time. So the first calendar had about 19 stories across a number of different categories: racial violence, policing, and so on. Whereas the calendar we published today has around 70 stories. I think that's testament to the hard work of staff, volunteers, and also the organisations whose work we make use of. So Stopwatch do a great monthly newsletter on policing. Are You Serious, which is a kind of network of researchers and activists across the borders of Europe who publish digests of the latest news from the border. So it's changed, it's expanded, and I think that's great. We have a lot to draw on. In terms of why it's important, I think firstly it's a brilliant portal into particular historical moments. So I returned to some of the calendars I first worked on in 2018, and it just brought back strong memories of particular events and particular moments. So things like the trial of the Stansted 15, the detention of humanitarian activists like Sean Binder and Sarah Mardini in Greece, the stripping of Shamima Begum's citizenship, Tommy Robinson being at large. And you can see the trace of all of these events and incidents in the response from the state over the last year or two. So the criminalization of solidarity in the Borders Bill, and new policing measures against protesters and so on. So I think you can, as Sivanandan said, you can really see how we got to where we are through kind of delving into the calendar. I think another thing as well, the closer attention you pay to developments week by week. So I try and read the calendar every week that it comes out, just so I stay abreast of things. And for example, there's only so many times you can read about the Met not being held accountable after a policing scandal before you stop believing in reform and you start calling for alternatives to policing. It really is an education to kind of immerse yourself in the developments on the ground. I think another reason why it's important, I think the scope, the categories that are covered. So you have racial violence, you have policing, borders and migration. You also have education, housing, employment, industrial action, counter-terror, national security. All of these categories are covered. And I think this speaks to an underlying conception of what racism is and what it looks like, and how it changes, because we understand it as something that's embedded across state institutions that shapes the economy, and the infrastructure of our societies, and that's an understanding that runs counter to the attempts made by the government and the elite and the ruling class to personalize racism, to deny institutional racism altogether as well, and to reduce it to euphemistic concepts like unconscious bias. The record we're keeping is of a much broader, a much more structural phenomenon, and I think that's really, really important. And obviously, with the breadth of the categories as well, you get not just the racism and the structures. You also get the resistance across the breadth of these areas. So you see the connections between the different struggles, and you see how the different struggles are related. And it shows what Sivanandan called the common denominators of oppression and exploitation, and how they point the way to a common struggle. And I think drawing the links and connections is really important. I think another reason why I think the calendar is important is the geographical scope, because it covers the UK. Obviously, that's where we're based, but also covers large parts of Europe, mostly EU countries. But yeah, it covers the UK and Fortress Europe. And obviously that allows us to draw connections, analyze trends at an international level, but it also draws its own insights. So I remember in March 2019, I think Liz Faculty and I worked on a kind of roundup of developments and responses to the Christchurch massacre, which was when 51 worshippers were killed at a mosque in Christchurch. And Liz wrote a piece about the massacre, contextualizing it. And what that work showed was that the gunman, wasn't just a lone wolf, wasn't just a kind of isolated eruption of pure evil. He was actually drawing influence and inspiration from a broader ecology of far-right ideas and figures across Europe. So it can draw those kinds of insights as well. And just from my perspective, in terms of the work that I do, obviously I work in the law, challenging mostly the Home Office, and you focus on a particular case, and you try and use the law to its full extent. But those protections that the law provides are being eroded more and more. The Nationality and Borders Bill is going to erode it even further. So I think being able to read the calendar and see what acts of resistance are occurring, not just in the UK but across Europe, is one of the things that keeps me going. Reading about the search and rescue missions run by CI, SOS Mediterranean, Open Arms, and above all, the acts of resistance by people on the move themselves. So the El Hebrew 3, for example, the 3 West African youths who were charged with terror offences in Malta for simply persuading the captain of the ship that rescued them to steer it back away from Libya, where they were going to be returned to. It's those kinds of acts of resistance that perhaps I wouldn't come across if I wasn't keeping up to date with the calendar. And that's what keeps me going, because ultimately, the law isn't going to save us. It's organization by, the people themselves. So, yeah, those are just some reflections, and I hope everyone, has a look at the register and see what use they can make of it.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was really great. Next, we will be hearing from John Grayson. John Grayson is an activist researcher with SIMAG, which is the South Yorkshire Migration and Asylum Action Group, and lives in Barnsley. Over the last 10 years, he has written pieces for IRR News and Open Democracy, mainly focusing on the asylum system and asylum housing linked to SIMAG campaigning. So over to you, John.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this. I think that I am an independent activist researcher, has worked with SIMAG, South Yorkshire Migration and Asylum Action Group, since its foundation in 2007, so some 15 years or so. But I'm also, by background, an academic historian, and I've published and researched in the field of social movement history and trade union history, etc. So you can see that from those two angles, I mean, I've seen the calendar of excuse me, racism and resistance actually quite very useful in terms of my practice and everyday kind of work. In the work that I've done with SIMAG over the years, basically, I mean, what I've done and published is, in a sense, kind of parallel to the calendar, because I see research in this field of asylum rights, etc., as not just interesting, but actually of central value to the campaigning organisation that SIMAG is, and that over the years, the calendar has also acted as a wonderful resource for us in terms of campaigning. I can think of many leaflets where we've quoted something from the calendar events or something else from the IRR. And I think that people outside the IRR perhaps undervalue the name, the label, Institute of Race Relations, because my experience is that people see that as authoritative, that, oh, well, yeah, so that's from the IRR, is it? And I think that's quite crucial, that the IRR has built up over the years, that kind of legitimacy, that authority, but also its connection with everyday struggle, like the campaigns that SIMAG have instituted over the years. I think that linked to the calendar, and I presume it will appear in the wider register. I mean, what is crucial is that the kind of research and kind of reporting in the calendar has an immediate impact. There's no kind of gap between publication, or at least design of publication, and its impact. I think that's absolutely crucial, because coming from an academic research background, I mean, the kind of stuff that's come out, there's quite a lot of good stuff in this field. I mean, it can take 2 years from actually researching it to actually getting it out there and disseminate in the form of publications or articles. And the real value of the kind of work that IRR does, and the calendar, and hopefully the new register, is almost instant. It's out there. People are reading it, and it has a great effect. So I think that's a crucial kind of element in the whole kind of value of the calendar, and hopefully the register as well. I think that going back to the IRR's authority, I think that, I've done stuff which has appeared on IRR news. I remember one piece I did for IRR news, and I remember the House of Commons Library telling me that they'd put it in a bundle for MPs, a particular MP's debate, and obviously they saw that. I write a lot and write for Open Democracy and all sorts of people, but they saw that's an IRR article, therefore it has some authority, and it went as background to MPs in that debate. I know I'm stressing this a lot, but I think it is actually quite crucial. I think people in IRR perhaps don't realise just how trusted and how authoritative IRR stuff is in the wider anti-racist campaigning. And I believe wider than that. I have friends who work loosely in this field in local authorities and in other NGOs, etc. And they quote to me, something that they've read recently in the calendar, and I'm sure a wider kind of database, so to speak, they'll take advantage of that as well. I think also I'd like to just spend a moment in terms of the import. I don't want to make this crude, but the false news kind of debates, etc. I don't want to really enter into that seriously, but I think that it does highlight that even if we look at database, we look at the kind of stuff that's around to help inform the campaigns for anti-racism. One of the really important words, and people have mentioned this already, and I think we recognise it, but I think it should be recognised more widely. This is a calendar of racism and resistance, and that crucial word resistance, places the kind of information, the data that is produced by the calendar of events. I look at other kind of sources of data in the field. The observatory, was founded at Oxford, which was founded only a few years ago. They produce a lot of good stuff really in terms of asylum data, etc. But because it's not about resistance, the kind of way they present it, etc., is the dry academic stuff, which only hardened researchers like myself actually enjoy inputting, etc. And the other thing is that a lot of the kind of influence in this field in terms of information is that great big data kind of world where now researchers search a word or a phrase or something, or and go through literally thousands of kind of references. And again, that doesn't, okay, it's useful for research and it's useful to make people aware of all that. But that's not what I call critical discourse analysis, and put a grand term on that. And that's exactly what I think that the calendar has done over the years. It doesn't simply record; it critically analyses and confronts the kind of world of information, the world of reporting, etc. And that word resistance is the key to that critical analysis that, in fact, that the calendar has become well known for, and also hopefully in the future the register will take that place. So you can see I found it useful over the years, and I found it useful, the calendar being very useful in terms of the everyday business of we've been around a long time, and we've had lots and lots of kind of good campaigns, etc., over the years. And many of those, if not all, have been informed. It's not only me who reads the calendar in CIMAC, obviously other people do as well and quote it. But it's actually immediately had an impact in terms of the campaign we wage in that particular point. And I think that is an amazing kind of effect, an amazing success for this long-standing calendar, and I'm sure it will lead to the success of the register in the future. And I'd just like to thank IRR for actually, producing that calendar over the years, and also bringing us together today to launch yet another kind of crucial kind of resource for organisations like SciMag. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That was really great. And our final speaker of the evening is Habib Kadiri, and he is the Policy and Research Manager for Stopwatch, an organisation that works to promote fair, effective and accountable policing in England and Wales, with a primary focus on stop and search. He joined the organisation in 2021, having volunteered in his capacity since 2018. He has an academic background in political economy, having completed an MA in the subject from the University of Manchester, and a decade of professional public health expertise in alcohol policy. So over to you, Habib.
Thank you. Yes, so just wanted to very quickly say about Stopwatch that we, as you were saying, work to for fair and accountable and effective policing in England and Wales. We were set up in 2010, and one thing that connects us with IRR is that we have a few people who are involved in IRR, and one person in particular on our board, Lee Bridges, who is a member of your Council of Management. And I think for us, that link is very important, because when it comes to having a kind of gathering data, especially in my position as well, in particular, gathering data and information about the misdoings of the police in this country, especially with a view to kind of understanding the institutional racism of the police force, then we have, a common goal. And Stopwatch, we try to kind of make this known through an evidence base that we kind of draw upon to kind of inform our policy positions. But in particular, there's a deluge of things that happen that we try to keep a record of ourselves with our monthly newsletter. And we find that because there's so much going on, we cannot always cover it all. And we also try to kind of like look at the evidence and try to kind of forge kind of like a position on why things are the way they are. And that kind of analysis takes up quite a bit of space and time, and with IIR, the register is a really brilliant idea. It's really brilliant to kind of draw upon, to kind of see just very straightforwardly, very factually what goes on from day to day. And so it's really great to draw upon that, and it's an invaluable resource that not just ourselves, but I imagine other organizations as well, the civil society organizations with similar aims in mind would love to kind of use. And we're all very, very happy to kind of see this be digitized and taken forward into the 21st century. So we're really pleased to be here, and I kind of wanted to keep it short so that we could get to questions as soon as possible, and to kind of talk more about how IRR are going to kind of develop the resource and what benefits there are for people like ourselves and people who are interested in the kind of chronicling and kind of drawing upon the racist institutions, activities of racist institutions in this country. So yeah.
And also it's cool. Thank you so much, Habib. It's really great to hear about Stopwatch and also its connection to the Institute, which goes back a long time. So now that we've heard from all our speakers, we're going to pass over to Liam, who's our communications officer, who will give a brief demonstration of what the Register of Racism and Resistance looks like and how it can be used. And after this, we'll move to questions. So do keep the questions coming in the comment box. But over to you, Liam.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Sophia. I am now going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Anya, can you? Yeah, great. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. This is our website, the IRR website, and we now have the register of racism and resistance here under, if you go to the homepage, if you go to educational resources, you'll find the register of racism and resistance. And here it is. So I'll just sort of briefly talk through the database. As Joseph mentioned, we've got various categories that we sort of log stories from across the UK and Europe. You'll see that here that we've got over 12,000 calendar entries dating back from 2014. You can see here, these are listed in terms of how many entries we have for each category. So you can see that our biggest category by far is asylum, migration, borders, and citizenship, followed by racial violence and harassment. So in terms of using the database, you can obviously search by category if you have a particular interest in, for example, anti-fascism on the far right. You can filter by that, and it will show you all the stories in chronological order related to anti-fascism on the far right. You can also search by country. Now, as we mentioned, most of the stories we have are based in the UK, but you can see we have quite a lot for France, quite a lot for Germany, and we are sort of adding more and more. I mean, previously we didn't necessarily record that many stories in Eastern Europe, obviously given what's been happening in Ukraine, various things happening around like the Poland-Belarus border recently. We are starting to add more there, so you can see there's quite a few entries for Ukraine. You see that a lot of those are very sort of recent stories. And you can also just use the usual search function, which is here. If anyone's Q case that kicked off a couple of weeks ago, you'll see that there's also, you'll find stories about the child Q case as well. So that's just to give you an idea. Another little feature that we've added as well, which is potentially quite nice, is we have like an on this day content. So, you know, if you're looking for maybe an anniversary, or if you're looking at, you know, what maybe happened on this day, on March 31st, it will show you all the stories. Well, in this case, that's because there's an extra filter there, the child. So yeah, there's 35 different stories that we have that all happened on this day. So yeah, I will leave it there, but please do check out the resource. As I say, it's under our educational resources on our website, which is irr.org.uk. Definitely check it out. And as Anya mentioned, it's a live resource. You know, we'll obviously be adding to it. We'll be, you know, making changes, making tweaks, improving it as we go. So hopefully this can be, you know, a resource that everyone can continue to use and we can learn from. Okay, I will bring people back in now.
Amazing, thank you, Liam. We're now going to move to the Q&A with our speakers, and actually I've got a few questions for the speakers that have just come to mind whilst they were speaking. So maybe we'll start with those as questions continue to come in. So my first question was for Sujata, because, yeah, I wondered, as graphic design is also a really important part of your work, and also as chair of the Grunwick 40 campaign, I remembered that you created a really beautiful mural in Willesden Green to commemorate the Grunwick strikers. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about this project, but also the role of community art and particularly murals in keeping a record of racism. Because it really struck me as you were speaking that actually this is also a really important part of the record, is actually all this visual material that campaigns produce over time.
It's a really good question, actually. It's a really good question. When we first started looking at what to do to commemorate the anniversary, I went and looked at the paper archives that were held in the Brent Museum and Archive in the local library. And I was really struck by the amount of visual material. There was a huge number of press cuttings, obviously, because it was an event that had national press attention. But there are also like these incredible photographs, like really stunning photographs, flyers for benefit gigs, incredible kind of handmade posters that people had made for fundraising events. And it just struck me as a really, really visual event. And I mean, not to mention the fact that the photographs that came out of that protest were really quite inspiring and quite unique for that time. And so when we were thinking about what to do, we thought, yeah, we'll have an exhibition, but we knew that exhibitions are ephemeral, right? You know, that you put them on and they're there for 2 months and then they're gone. So we wanted to have something a bit more long lasting, you know, permanent, semi-permanent. I hope, you know, I'm not quite sure what the lifespan of this mural will be, but, you know, I hope it will be fairly permanent. And so we also kind of wanted to get away from the idea of one person creating an artwork. Our feeling was very much that this was a collective struggle. It was a struggle of not just one person, a leader, Jaya Ben Desai, but the struggle of all those workers in that factory, the struggle of all those workers who came out in solidarity with that strike, and you know, the residents and the broader community as well. You know, it was a huge event, so we really wanted to reflect that. And there were lots of debates about, you know, should we have a statue or something like that to mark it. But we really wanted something very bold and very colourful, and something that would be a collective artwork. So we actually commissioned a local artist who's experienced in community art, and held a series of workshops where they could participate. And they had a method of screen printing where you would trace archive photographs. So we collated a whole load of archive photographs, and people traced them and turned them into screen prints. And what that meant was that everybody could participate. You didn't need to be a particularly talented artist to have a go, and people of sort of very, very varying abilities took part in that and all felt included. And so what you see in the picture that's up on the screen is a montage, a collage of all those different artworks that were created by, I think it was over 50 people that came to those different workshops, including a couple of the strikers, actually. And then they were all montaged by an artist, and the colour added and put together. So what you've got is something that's really very collectively produced, which we thought was really appropriate. And yeah, the murals are still there, you know, just by Dollis Hill Tube Station if you want to go and have a look. But I thought that visual element is really important for, I think, people who weren't around at the time of the strike but walk past this mural every day now. And you know, we often get questions about, you know, who are these people, what was this about? And you know, although there's a little explanatory text on it, people still want to know more. We see that by, you know, the hits on the website, that people are still searching it and still looking at it. So I think it's a very bold and very visual way of documenting that history. And I think we kind of made pains to make sure that people were included in that history. So not just the Asian women who led the strike, but there were African Caribbean women involved in that strike. There were a number of Irish people. There were postal workers. There were miners and dockers, and so on. And I think, you know, the mural was the right medium to reflect the nature of it, and it seems to have gone down fairly well. So.
Thanks, Sujata. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, when you're talking, just thinking that the strike itself was a collective action, but then actually the mural also being a collective piece of work that sort of makes it like a living history that people walk past every day and then continue to like ask questions about and do their own research into what the strike involved in that moment of history is really interesting. So thanks for speaking to us about that. So next, I have a question for Joseph, as both a caseworker and also an activist, which is, what do you think the role of individual cases plays in fueling activism? Because you touched a bit upon this while you were speaking, and it just reminded me of one particular quote by Sivanandan, which is turning cases into issues, issues into causes, causes into a movement. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a great quote, and I think it's true. And you know, you just have to see the many scandals that have rocked the Metropolitan Police over the last couple of years to see, you know, the power of the individual case, and when it's inserted into, you know, mobilizations and protests and new forms of community activism, and with Child Q as well. I think the point I was making about law, I think when we say case, obviously it's often a legal case as well. But I think the problem with law comes when people see kind of the struggle in the courts as the kind of main arena for the struggle, whereas really it should be in the community. It should be on the streets, because you know the judiciary is pretty conservative. The government can change the law with a strong majority whenever it wants. So really, when you're turning a case into an issue and an issue into a movement, if that's the way the quote goes, I can't remember. It's got to be led by, you know, the people who are most affected, and I think that's, you know, probably the most promising political development over the last couple of years in relation to Black Lives Matter, racist policing. It's those cases that provoke wider discussions and debates about, you know, the purpose of the police, for example. What function do they play in society? What alternatives are there to keeping people safe, and, you know, securing human happiness? And I think, you know, we're quite fortunate that, I mean, well, you know, it's horrible. The cases are horrible themselves, but we're fortunate that, you know, people are organizing and discussing ideas that point to alternatives. So yeah, the individual case is absolutely crucial, and there are plenty to get behind at the moment in the UK, from deaths in custody to, you know, molestation of children to, you know, plenty of other things. So yes, definitely. And yeah, as someone who works in the law, you know, obviously it's a necessary job, important job, but everything else is much more important. You just do the bit you can do within the law, but you have to, what's most important is what you do outside of the law, on the ground and in the community. So yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. That's really interesting. I have a question for Habib, which kind of links from what Joseph was saying, which is about this this method of police monitoring and how police monitoring is important to your work, because over the last few years we've seen police cop watches being set up across the country, which is part of a really long tradition that goes back to the Black Panthers. But it's also key to your work at Stopwatch. And you mentioned the newsletter you produce, which monitors key developments in policing. So I wondered if you could say a bit about this role of police monitoring.
Yeah, so for us, it's very important, as I was saying before, that when we're drawing upon an evidence base for our work, that we look at all different types of sources and we try to pull them in from as a wide and a variety of areas as possible. And we not just kind of bring them in, but we hope to kind of synthesize them to, what's appropriate in terms of bringing a narrative together to kind of make sense of what's going on, so that people don't just see a bunch of stories and don't understand where we're coming from on them. So when we then forge together the stories for our newsletter, we kind of try to say, okay, look, this is what's happening in addition to all the things that we've recounted from previous months. You can see patterns emerging. You can see why the police are the way they are. And so we find it's very important to monitor everything that's going on so that we can kind of say, look, there's a strong kind of body of evidence as to kind of what the police are truly like, despite what their narrative is to mainstream media. So we find that, as I was saying before, the sources like the calendar are going to be incredibly important for us. It's going to make our job easier when it comes to monitoring, and by extension, other cop watching groups and other interested parties in policing matters will find it easier to understand exactly what the police are like in this country, especially for people of color.
Thank you so much. And I think it's particularly important when the government line is that institutional racism doesn't exist, that actually we have the evidence to show what it's like on the ground and what are people's lived experiences of it. Which leads me to my next question, which is for John. Because one of the main sections in the register is the asylum and migration section, which is where your work fits. And particularly this section, it documents the infrastructure and the impact of immigration regimes. But one thing that we're conscious of with the register is the risk of perhaps turning individual stories into a statistic. But what really strikes me about your work and your writing, John, particularly in your interviews and with people living in asylum housing, is that you always highlight the human experiences of those living and caught up in the system, and also their lived realities on the ground. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about your work, which often centers the lived experiences of the most vulnerable.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, for the last 10 years or so, I mean, most of my SciMag research has focused on the asylum system and in general, asylum housing and accommodation. And I think that, I mean, one of the things why it comes out as it does in the human story is there is very often because of my editors, and that includes the IRR. We've always kind of sometimes reshaped my stories to just forefront particular experience. I've always valued that, and that's a thing I continue doing. I think that it's interesting that I think I was the only housing academic in the the early period I was writing, to actually be looking at asylum housing from the asylum tenants, the housing tenants' point of view. And I think that's because the mainstream academic institutions won't touch this field at all. They see it as racialized, as politicized, and that's the last thing the modern university wants to research and try and get ESRC funding for. So that whole period of research actually, turned out to be much more important than I realized at the time. But I think that people often ask me, well, how do I do it? How do I get into asylum housing? To actually log the responses, etc., and disseminate them, write about them. And I think this is, again, I was talking about IRR being trusted. Well, CIMAC, as an organisation that is in our networks in Yorkshire and the North East, is extremely trusted, and we get the the network to actually talk about CIMAC, a network of asylum seekers, refugees, talking about CIMAC. So when I turn up at an asylum house, although it's since COVID, that's been one of the things that I haven't done too much of. I mean, even if they haven't asked me to go there, most of the time people ask me to go to their house because of a housing problem. But if they haven't, if I go to a house because I want to investigate something, I only have to say, well, I'm John Grayson, I'm from CIMAC, the organisation. That immediately sets up a trust relationship, and I think that's the key to actually getting the human stories out there in terms of housing or other asylum rights issues. And I think it's also important to realise that in this field, we have to congratulate the asylum seekers, refugees, for actually putting their head above the parapet. And obviously, I anonymise all the data, etc. But I mean, it takes courage. They're constantly told, you complain, you say anything, and we're going to report you to the Home Office, and it will affect your asylum claim. Now, whether that's true or not, and I'm a bit sceptical about that, to be quite honest, but people think that's what's going to happen, and they're terrified of actually, not only complaining but speaking to people, the press, etc., about their situation. So we've been able to overcome that, as I say, by that kind of trust relationship. And I think that, the story kind of approach has its weaknesses, but certainly on dry topics like housing, one needs to humanize it by actually, I take a lot of photographs as well. And I think that's crucial, to document the horrible conditions that people are living in. And people send me videos from asylum housing and from other places, showing. And I regard that, people say, oh, it's humanizing, it's good stories, John. It isn't, it's testimony. Because my experience has shown that asylum seekers in those houses or accommodation want the truth to get out there. They want me to actually, disseminate, to spread the word about what's happening. And I think that, I see it as testimony for people who are in the system and themselves want to improve the system, and therefore, give me data in discussions and interviews, etc. So I think, that's absolutely crucial to my approach and to the work I've done and published with IRR. Okay.
We all really value. Thank you, John, and we all really value the work that you've done for the IRR, particularly around the interviews and amplifying people's experiences of asylum housing, which is so important. So we're now going to move on to some technical questions which have come up in the chat. Firstly, thank you everyone for all the really nice comments about our work and the IRR more broadly, which we all really appreciate hearing. So yeah, this is the first question, and Liam is going to be answering these technical questions as they come up. So over to you, Liam.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. So this question from Christian, in terms of adding to the calendar, it's a bit complex because I guess the first thing we should say, and that we've always said about the calendar, is it is not absolutely 100% comprehensive. It is obviously sort of curated. We, as Joseph mentioned, we've gone from calendar entries from being smaller to being much larger, and we do obviously cover, you know, all over Europe, but at the same time, we are relatively selective for certain reasons in terms of what we cover, and there's political reasons for that. In terms of sort of like retrospectively adding things, I'm not sure. I mean, this is where it becomes a question about like capacity and resource as well. We are an extremely small organisation, so I mean, to some extent, I like the idea of potentially it being sort of participatory thing, but I think it will be a real challenge, to be honest. I mean, maybe it could be something in the future, but yeah, that's how I would answer that question. But thanks very much, Christian. And I think there was also a question about visual stuff from Alexis. So Alexis was asking if there's any visual material from the register that could be licensed. The register essentially is a database of news stories from all over the internet. So it's a curated resource of material that is already on the internet. There aren't particularly any sort of visual elements to it, apart from images that we have added to our calendars that might appear next to stories. So there are a few images, and some of these images are extremely powerful. A lot of these images are sort of protest images of struggles, resistance, you know, all sorts of images from across Europe. So yeah, it's typically more textual than visual, but you know, there are some things on there that if you search the register, you will find entries that have images next to them. So thanks, Alexis. Okay, they're the technical questions.
So yeah, if there's any other questions, please do post them in the chat. There was one question that came in, which I thought was quite interesting, which is about the role of making transnational connections, because actually the calendar covers the UK and Europe. But as Joseph was speaking, he was talking about that we actually created an additional calendar at the time to highlight the Christchurch attack that happened in New Zealand. But actually what we documented was the resonances and the repercussions of that attack in New Zealand and what happened in the UK and Europe afterwards, which included attacks on mosques and attacks on people. And also, for instance, we all remember the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted in 2020. We also created a unique calendar documenting what happened in UK and Europe as a result of BLM protests, which included, you know, mass protests breaking out across Europe, but also a backlash against those protests as well. So I wondered if any of our speakers would be interested in talking about the importance of making transnational links, whether that is resistance or finding patterns of racism across Europe and globally as well. So I wondered if Joseph had something to say about that.
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, the importance of transnational connections in, you know, the field of immigration, asylum, and borders is obviously pretty straightforward. The purpose of, you know, legislation like the Nationality and Borders Bill is to, you know, fortify Britain into, you know, a fortress, and to pull us away from our responsibilities to the rest of the world. because, you know, obviously we are in large part responsible for the state of much of the rest of the world, and we have a duty and obligation to welcome people. And, you know, in order to overcome and transcend the limits placed on us by the government, by the state, by law, transnational connections are crucial. Because, you know, the state and capital and racism operates transnationally, so we obviously have to as well. So with the Poland-Belarus border crisis, for example, you have British, I can't remember if it's members of the British military, but whatever it was, going over and helping out on the border to basically block migrants out, and then they freeze to death in the woods. So, you know, because the state, because capital operates transnationally, we have to as well. What that means in practice is obviously, you know, more complex, but it can happen. You know, the Institute has supported migrant solidarity activists, you know, Sean Binder, Sarah Mardini, for example, who I mentioned, who've been on trial in Greece or still awaiting trial. And that's a form of concrete solidarity. We all know people who are either, you know, crossing borders or going out and working at the borders in solidarity with people. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that we can do, and we can hold events, and we can publicize these things, and we can provide different kinds of support. But I think, yeah, it's crucial because that's the way the world works, and we have to operate transnationally as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really, really good to hear. Which also leads to a question that I've just seen in the chat from Catherine Rushforth, which says, I'm new to IRR. Which government's departments do you regularly present to? And I thought this was a good opportunity to explain what the IRR does, because we don't really directly present to government departments. But what we do is we produce resources, like we're an anti-racist charity, we produce publications and analysis that we hope can sort of amplify what's going on at the grassroots, but also fuel resistance movements as well. So we don't necessarily speak to people in power, but we speak from the position of the most marginalized and most vulnerable. And that's always been really key to our work. And we have lots of different avenues that our work goes in. So I mentioned our international journal, Race and Class, which is a quarterly journal. So that's the more scholarly aspect of our work. But we also have IRR News, which is what the Anti-Racist Record is really launching, which is a more immediate form of news, which is an online news platform which you can subscribe to at the end of this webinar if you're not already connected to. And at the IRR, we also hold an archive which documents anti-racist struggles going back decades. So if you're interested in anti-racist history, you can always book an appointment to come and view the archive. And I've just seen that in the chat, there's some really nice comments that we've had. So I thought I would read them out for everyone to hear. Bill McKeith, a salute to IRR, CARF and Sujata for hosting the Anti-Immigration Detention Network in the 90s. So that's really nice to hear. Claire Gregory, IRR has been an incredibly valuable resource to me since 2001 during social work training and postgraduate research. That's really great to hear, especially how our work is helping you in your field of social work. We have a really nice comment from SciMag, where it says it's especially important for regional organizations like SciMag to have a national and Europe-wide resource. Knowledge is power and helps us make links, which I think really summarizes what we're doing, really. And finally, we have one from Wayne. IRR has been my go-to source since the 1980s, when Siva's article was photocopied and passed around at community events and universities alike. Thanks for keeping this tradition alive, which is really nice to hear, and also goes back to what Sujata was saying, how, you know, she used to cut and stick press cuttings, and how, you know, physical articles were handed out at protests, And we're living in a very different world now, and we have to think of different ways of keeping that tradition alive, including in the online and digital space. So thank you so much for your comments. I'll now, if anyone else wants to say anything else or answer any other questions, now is the time. Or if not, I'll hand over to Anya to round it off.
Yes, so finally I have the great job of the thank yous. So first of all, thank you to all of our speakers. You know, without you, we wouldn't have had an event, and you were all incredibly interesting and really engaging. So thank you all so much for coming and for contributing. We've also got to thank our funders, without whom the IRR 50 events and this database would not be able to be completed. So that's Paul Hamlin, Resourcing Racial Justice, and Lippman Miliband. Also, a huge thank you to GreenNet, who actually built the database in its entirety, and also the technical tool that allows the calendars to become searchable items in it, which was absolutely no mean feat. As Liam mentioned previously, there's over 12,000 entries that had to be collated and created, and more will be coming every 2 weeks. And then also, we absolutely could not have done any of this without our volunteers over the years. And you will see there, it is a very long list, because creating this calendar takes up a awful lot of work. It's a lot of people doing a lot of searches, and without them there is absolutely no way that we would have been able to keep the calendar going. So seriously, thank you to all of our volunteers. Especially thank you to Yoande, who actually read through and categorized all of the calendar stories. There was a massive data dump that she had to go through, all the stories from 2014, and she made them all, kind of went through them and checked them to make sure that they would be usable and serviceable in the new database format. So thank you so much to her. We really, really appreciate it, and could not have done it without her. And so then, just to close, I will say, please do subscribe to our news service, where you'll receive each new calendar every fortnight, and then also any articles that we publish as well. And also follow us on social media. And finally, please do use the database for anything and everything you need. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and do let us know how you get on with the register and how you use it, because we're always really interested to know.
Great. Thanks, guys.